Instead of reading being a fun time, like it was for everybody else, it was a time I dreaded most when in school. It was the beginning of my first grade year, and I was so nervous to start all-day school. One day, my teacher, Mrs. Schultz, called my name as she locked eyes with me. I could feel a lump in my throat as I followed her across the hall into a secluded room with nothing but old gray carpet, white walls, and 2 chairs placed across from each other. She handed me a piece of paper. She told me to start reading the list of simple sentences. Here I go. I was worried she would not be able to hear my voice over my pounding heart. The dog, sat. The boy jumped. She told me I needed to speak up. The cow jumped over the moon. Know my name. Time's up. I didn't realize how clammy my hands had become as I walked back to the classroom. Why was I so nervous? I've read in front of my mom so many times before. I sat down at my short beige desk in my chair that only a first grader could fit in. I remember feeling so dumb for tensing up and barely being able to get words out when I read to Mrs. Schultz. I wonder why we have to read to her. I tried forgetting about the incident. All right, class, it's reading time. Everybody take a seat on the floor, Mrs. Schultz said. I scurried over to take a seat on the floor, when all of a sudden, a woman opened the door. You'll be coming with me, she said with a smile. I took the walk of shame in front of my whole first grade class. Out the door, through the hallway, and into Mrs. Barry's reading room. Reading room? Why aren't I staying with all the other kids in my class? The woman led us to the same room that I had read to Mrs. Schultz in the week before. This time, it said Mrs. Barry's reading room on the door. Also, it wasn't a bare room anymore. There was a round table with 1 big chair and 5 first grader-sized chairs around it. The walls were filled with encouraging posters and shelves upon shelves of colorful children's books. She introduced herself as Mrs. Barry. She was an older woman with short gray hair and librarian glasses. She hadn't stopped smiling this whole time. Then Mrs. Barry said this. After hearing you read, your teacher noticed that you kids need extra help with your reading skills. But not to worry, it is my job to help you so you can catch up to the other kids. Pretty soon, you'll be able to read like a pro. I'm so confused. Do they not think I can read? There has to be some mistake. I sat there slouching in my small kiddie chair, doubting not only my reading ability, but also myself. The other kids in the group really did need help with their reading. They were excited to see Mrs. Barry walk through the door every day when it was reading time in school. I was the opposite. I felt as though I had been misunderstood. My shyness was mistaken for the lack of the ability to read at a normal first grade level. I let my nerves get the best of me. Instead of reading being a fun time, like it was for everybody else, it was a time I dreaded most when in school. I felt like I didn't belong in the special reading class with the struggling kids. Pretty soon, it came time for Mrs. Barry to evaluate our reading and to decide whether or not we could go back in the normal classroom for reading time. Angela, she said, how about you go first? Read the passage out loud to us. There's nothing to be afraid of. I can read. I am smart, I thought to myself. I read the sentences with ease. I continued on, reading so many more sentences than I had when I first read to Mrs. Schultz. Reading sentence after sentence gave me so much more confidence. I was beaming on the inside. I knew I did what it took in order to move out of the special reading class. I felt like myself again. Reading time went from something I dreaded to something I learned to love. It is safe to say that reading has defined who I am today. Reading brought me out of my shy, reserved, nervous shell I was in as a child. Ever since I got over my fear of reading and speaking aloud, I have not been quiet since. From that point on, I was always the kid who raised their hand to volunteer to read out loud. Reading is so important because it is something we do in our daily lives without even thinking about it. So I can't even imagine how life would be if I didn't like it. I can look back on this memory now and laugh because of how I really did hate reading for that little while. But I believe everything happens for a reason. And if it weren't for that, my love for reading would not be what it is today.